What if the early Christians didn't actually know who Jesus was? Richard Carrier has a new book out, and it's raised a serious problem for historians of early Christianity. The book makes a bold claim. One of the very first Christian texts may mention Jesus, yet reveal nothing about a real historical person. So why do writers centuries later describe Jesus in vivid detail, while those closest to his supposed lifetime say absolutely nothing? Okay, so I've recently read Richard Carrier's new book, The Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus. In his work, Carrier makes a striking series of observations about First Clement. This is an epistle from Clement, an early Christian leader, to the Christians of the city of Corinth in Greece, an early centre of Christianity in the Roman Empire. The epistle has traditionally been dated to the very end of the first century. However, Carrier argues that First Clement was actually written a half a century earlier and is one of the earliest of all Christian texts. Moreover, he notes that while the text mentions Jesus numerous times, it does not do so in any historical sense. And all the references of Jesus are kind of vague and rhetorical. For instance, Clement says, "This is the way, dearly beloved, wherein we found our salvation, even Jesus Christ, the high priest of our offerings, the guardian and helper of our weakness. Through him let us look steadfastly unto the heights of the heavens." Based on this, Carrier argues that Clement, one of the earliest of Christian writers, basically had no idea who Jesus was meant to have been. He simply had a general idea that he was meant to be a sort of key figure in the Christian church, but this early Christian leader and writer couldn't say anything meaningful about a historical Jesus at all. And by way of contrast, Christian writers 2 centuries later could wax lyrical on Christ and his actions, despite being at a massive time remove. And Carrier argues that this is just one example of how the argument that Jesus ever existed falls down under close examination. Here I want to look at Carrier's argument in the Obsolete Paradigm and ask, does Carrier's thesis stack up? First things first, who is Richard Carrier?
The belief that some cosmic Jewish zombie can make you live forever if you symbolically eat his flesh and telepathically tell him that you accept him as your master so he can remove an evil force from your soul that is present in humanity because a rib woman was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree. And there really isn't a single proposition in there that your average Christian can honestly deny.
Carrier has been a prolific writer of books and articles on Jesus and the early Christian church for many, many years. He was born in Orange County, California in 1969 and was raised as a Methodist. He received a BA in history from the University of California at Berkeley in 1997 before undertaking an MA, an MPhil and then a PhD, all at Columbia University. His PhD thesis was entitled Attitudes Towards the Natural Philosopher in the Early Roman Empire, 100 BC to 313 AD. As soon as he finished his doctoral studies, Carrier began publishing numerous papers on early Christianity and the possibility that Jesus Christ never existed. These really interesting ideas were then brought together in his 2014 book on the historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt, which Sheffield Phoenix Press published. In this, Carrier argued that Jesus never existed and that the non-biblical or extra-biblical evidence usually used to prove his existence is illegitimate.
Dr. Carrier, what is your best argument and evidence that Jesus never existed, considering it's a minority position?
Yeah, it's 2 things really that converge together. One is that we don't have any secular evidence for the historicity of Jesus. It's all mythological for the actual historical man. It all comes from myth. Usually when we look at people who, gods and heroes and so forth, whose principal mode of existence is in myth, they usually don't exist. So we need something more for Jesus than just he exists in these mythologies. And when we look at the earliest evidence, which is the letters of Paul, the authentic letters of Paul, A historical Jesus isn't really there in the normal sense. Now, he believes in a historical Jesus in the same sense as he believed in a historical Satan, right? But of course, we don't think Satan really existed. Satan is this celestial being that had a historical war with God and so forth. But of course, that's all imaginary. And when you read Paul without colored glasses, when you're not reading it with a dogmatic assumptions of the field, you find that there just is no historical earthly Jesus there. He only talks about a Jesus who is celestial, who only communicates through revelation. No one ever met him personally. And that's very conspicuous throughout across the letters. He says this multiple times. All of the stuff you'd expect him to talk about is not there. And so when you combine those two pieces of evidence, it makes a pretty strong case that there wasn't a Jesus. Now, of course, that leads to a whole bunch of but what about, and of course that would get into a much longer video, but that's why I did the whole study, to actually go point by point by point. And I have a new book coming out called The Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus that really goes into this in more detail in terms of the attempts to rehabilitate the historical Jesus in the last 10 years since I published my last peer-reviewed study on it. And the case for Jesus is worse now than it was then. So
why don't scholars in general agree with you?
Yeah, well, first of all, most of them aren't even reading the studies, right? They're defending a dogma. They're not actually bothering to interact with the study itself. So the other part of it is that they're operating on a bunch of faith assumptions. Even when they're not believers, they have basically been taught and raised in these faith assumptions and keep just using them. I mean, to give an example, when I was in a debate with Mark Goodacre on this, and he's not like a fundamentalist or anything, he kept arguing that Paul says he learned the gospel from the apostles before him. But he never says that. And I kept pointing out, that's not in there. But he kept saying, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. But he really did believe that there was somewhere in the letters of Paul that he said this, because this is a faith doctrine that just gets taught in the field, and they just believe that that's the case. There are many other aspects, many other arguments like this. The idea that the word crucifixion only ever referred to Roman crucifixion, which is false. But people believe it, and they just keep repeating it, and they're not checking.
This established Carrier as the leading proponent of the mythicist theory, that holds that Jesus was a mythical character that Christians built up as a supposed leader of their movement. So then he has continued to publish books with often provocative titles like Jesus from Out of Space. In 2025, he published The Obsolete Paradigm of the Historical Jesus as a kind of reflection on the reception of On the Historical Jesus, just a decade on from first publishing it. But does Carrier's argument have any merit? So let's look at Carrier's methodology. This falls down into two categories. On the one hand, Carrier engages in what might be called conventional textual criticism in order to cement the idea that Jesus might have never existed. Skeptics of the early history of Christianity point to the fact that beyond the New Testament and other non-canonical Christian texts, there is very little tangible evidence for any kind of existence of a man named Jesus dating to the 1st century CE, or most of the 2nd. It's really only from 170 that the number of people discussing Jesus outside of Christian circles really increases. Carrier argues that we have to look at this non-Christian evidence to try and see if Jesus existed. He notes the slim nature of it, and also questions the early non-Christian evidence. For instance, there are really just 3 non-Christian writers who mention Jesus, or Christians prior to around 150. These are the Roman historian Tacitus, Josephus, and the Roman politician Pliny the Younger. Pliny's reference is to the Christian movement more broadly in the 110 CE, and does not really constitute evidence of the existence of Jesus. And Carrier questions Tacitus's fleeting single reference to Jesus as well. Carrier notes that scholars have long questioned whether the references to Jesus in Josephus's writings are accurate, with most agreeing that they are later forgeries. This more conventional textual criticism in Carrier's book is overlaid with a use of mathematical probability. Carrier is an advocate of the use of the Bayesian probability theory. This is named after the 18th century English mathematician Thomas Bayes, and is basically a theorem or equation for working out what the probability of something happening or having happened based on a lot of conditional factors incorporated into the equation itself. It is often used in statistics and quite a bit of analysis to try and work out what the likelihood of assumptions are and where biases can be proved statistically incorrect. Thus, Carrier incorporates things like the lack of early non-biblical references to Jesus, alongside its mathematical likelihood that he would be referenced in more ancient texts if he had actually existed, to come up with a view of what the statistical likelihood of Jesus' existence might have been. Using this Bayesian approach, Carrier concludes, both in the Obsolete Paradigm and his earlier writings, that the mathematical likelihood of Jesus having existed is, unsurprisingly, very slim. As points of comparison, he details how other individuals who might be considered to have had similar or indeed much lesser historical impact than Jesus did feature much more frequently in books written about the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries. In the Obsolete Paradigm, he doubles down on this approach and wants to suggest that the problem with those who reject the mythicist theory is that they simply refuse to take the mathematical probability into account when it comes to evaluating the historical Jesus or his potential of not existing. So does Carrier's argument have a lot to support it? To be honest, I think there are a lot of points which Carrier raises that scholars of early Christian movements tend to conveniently overlook. For instance, there is no doubting that the few fragments in the writings of Josephus where Jesus is mentioned have been interfered with by later Christian writers who copied out these manuscripts in late antiquity or early medieval times. One of these passages, known as, is unquestionably a Christian forgery, as Josephus states that Jesus was, quote, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. This is not something Josephus, who was not a Christian, would have written. Still, while Carrier is right to point out these issues, he then possibly overextends his argument by suggesting that this means that we cannot take any reference to Jesus in Josephus seriously. Most scholars of Josephus's work would not go this far. The book in question by Josephus, Jewish Antiquities or Antiquities of the Jews, covers a wide range of radical preachers, self-proclaimed messiahs in Roman Judea in the 1st century. And Josephus's reference to Jesus elsewhere in the middle of this describes him in normal terms as just one of these preachers. Turning to Carrier's use of Bayes' theorem, there is certainly a place to question whether there is a mathematical probability of Jesus having existed. I mean, it's indeed unusual that there are so few non-Christian references to Jesus for the better part of 150 years after his supposed death. But perhaps Carrier is being too mathematical here. There are simply scenarios in which evidence has just not survived from the ancient world for a strange set of reasons. Take the example of a near contemporary of Jesus, Marcus Terentius Varro. Varro lived from the late 2nd century BCE down to 27 BCE, the year the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire. He was clearly one of the most prolific writers of the Roman era, reputedly composing about 480 books on topics as diverse as history, philosophy, architecture, tragedy, and comedy, and urban and rural life. He was deemed to be one of the most important writers of the Roman world, alongside the likes of Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, and Cicero, the great rhetorician. And yet, except for a single book on architecture and rural life, none of Varro's works have survived. We get references to what he wrote secondhand in the writings of others, and snippets here and there. but all of his books were mostly lost in the transition from Roman times through to the medieval era and then to the Renaissance period. We only know about him for the most part because of the way in which the other Roman writers referred to him. The mathematical probability would be that the writings of the ancient writer like this, who was so revered, should have survived extensively, but clearly they haven't. This is just one example of how applying mathematical models to the study of the Roman era is problematic. It also calls into question what non-Christian evidence of Jesus' existence might not have survived. After all, if nearly every single one of Varro's books had been lost, then how likely is it that snippets from other texts of that era that mention Jesus have also been lost? Others have simply noted that the application of mathematical analysis to the historicity of Jesus ignores the fact that the New Testament texts were written more as parables than as strictly historical documents. Carrier's theories are super interesting, and they lead us to question received ideas, but there are also limitations to his methodological approach. And Carrier's book raises a lot of interesting points, and I think his work needs to be taken seriously. There is certainly room for questioning early Christian texts more closely and seeing, like in the instance of First Clement, whether or not they actually demonstrate any knowledge of the alleged historical Jesus, or if they simply refer to him in a vague rhetorical way. Others will possibly be put off by Carrier's resort to Bayesian mathematical equations to engage in probabilities. Look, it has to be said that this is a very unorthodox approach to historical analysis, albeit Carrier admits that this is kind of left field, and there is a wealth of other issues which arise from his work. We'll look at some of those in the next video. So what do you think? Do you think Carrier should be taken seriously? Because many people don't take his work seriously. Drop your comments below. To delve more into the complexity of early Christian history, be sure to tune into other videos on the channel. Okay, thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one.
God complex. Haters love to hate, but I never feel pressed. Got a lot on my plate, but I never get stressed.